Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond, for speaking with me today. President Biden is going to host the first ever summit for democracy on December 9th and 10th. How do you see the significance of this event? Can we expect any substantial fruit?
Well, I think certainly we can expect the substantial fruit of countries coming together to renew their commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I think we can also expect that countries in attendance will make commitments to advance the themes of the summit, such as fighting the authoritarian trend in the world, defending human rights, combating corruption, and trying to secure democracy where it's in trouble. So I think it's a good thing that countries are coming together around democratic principles, either countries that are democracies or at least where there's democratic prospects underway, and that the United States is exerting leadership again without imposing or controlling the agenda unilaterally.
President Biden has invited Taiwan to join the summit. Do you think it's a wise move?
Yes, I do, because Taiwan is a democracy, and it's called the Summit for Democracy. It's not called a summit of independent sovereign states. And so we don't take a position on the dispute between Taipei and Beijing over the status of Taiwan and the statehood of Taiwan by inviting Taiwan to the Summit for Democracy. It's a democratic political system. It would be almost perverse not to have it there.
Speaking of the role of Taiwan, do you think it is still serving as a shining example of the transition from non-democracy to democracy?
Yes, I do. I think that no democracy is perfect. Every democracy has its elements of friction, controversy, difficulty, stress. But I think Taiwan is the most liberal democracy in Asia, and one of the most successful cases of democratic evolution and consolidation during the entire third wave of democratic change. And indeed, I would say the quality of democracy in Taiwan is significantly higher than in the United States now. So I give Taiwan's people and its president, Tsai Ing-wen, a lot of credit for the progress they've made in institutionalizing democracy and the innovation that has been brought through digital governance and creative engagement of civil society. I give President Tsai a lot of credit for her restraint and lack of provocation on the issue of the cross-strait dispute. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. The risk it faces is not from internal weakness or polarization, although the problem of inter-party politics, inter-party competition is always a challenge in a democracy that has as spirited a level of political competition as exists between the two major parties in Taiwan. But the real problem stems from the increasing bellicose posture of the People's Republic of China and the periodic warnings and intimidations that it may use force to solve the conflict. So I think it's a good, necessary, and right step to include Taiwan in the Summit for Democracy.
The inclusion of Taiwan, of course, angered China, and China has been against the summit in an even larger sense. Recently, we've seen the China and the Russia ambassadors to the United States issue a joint op-ed decrying the democracy summit. They said, and I'll quote here, the U.S. plan is an evident product of its Cold War mentality, creating new dividing lines. So what's your take? Is the U.S. using democracy as a divisive geopolitical tool?
No, the U.S. is reaffirming its historic role, dating back for many decades, but particularly since 1977, of supporting and embracing the cause of freedom, democracy, and human rights as universal values, and as counterweights to projects of authoritarian domination and efforts to crush the human spirit, which the regimes in mainland China and Russia, unfortunately, very much embody. I think that any regime that is as deeply authoritarian as China and now increasingly Russia is, and that feels as insecure in its tenure as the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party state and the leaders in the Kremlin feel, any such regime is going to feel threatened when democracies of the world come together to reaffirm their commitment to democracy, to support democratic forces in the world, and to try to strengthen and improve their democracies. So this ideological, geopolitical, rhetorical bullying is no surprise, and it is very characteristic of the kind of rhetoric that we heard from communist adversaries during the Cold War. So I think the positive effort to embrace, improve, reaffirm democracy and human rights is in no way a Cold War gesture. But I do believe the kind of rhetoric and hysterical reaction to it that we are hearing from China and Russia is very much a Cold War reflex.
Currently, the Chinese Communist Party dislikes to be called out as an autocracy. And in the op-ed I've just mentioned, the China ambassador argued, and I quote here, democracy can be realized in multiple ways, and no model can fit all countries. No country has the right to judge the world's vast and varied political landscape by a single yardstick. And he described the Chinese model as an extensive, whole-process socialist democracy, of course echoed the statement made by the Chinese President Xi Jinping recently. So as a leader scholar in the field of democracy studies, do you think the Chinese so-called whole-process socialist democracy is a real democracy?
I don't have a word for this that I can use on the Voice of America. But I will try to make it acceptable to your audience by saying it's a complete, preposterous, ridiculous, Orwellian fiction to pretend that the Chinese Communist Party neo-totalitarian state in any way reflects or represents democratic values. And I would invite the Chinese ambassador and other, officials of the Politburo and apologists of the regime to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and explain to a global audience what portions of it they are not routinely violating. In Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and indeed in all of China, by their ruthless suppression of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of association, religious freedom, the right to language and identity, the right to independent political expression, the right to choose and replace your leaders. I mean, there isn't any part of it that the Chinese Communist Party state comes close to respecting. So this is a ridiculous fiction that nobody takes seriously.
But the CCP has been promoting this model, both to its own people and to the world. But let's face it, it's working to a certain extent. There is a big chunk of Chinese public sincerely believe their political system is superior to the Western democracy, even within the young generation. Do you find it worrisome?
Yes, I do find it worrisome. And I think we need to separate, make two kinds of distinctions. The first distinction is between what is a democracy or not, and whether a regime is preferable or superior or not. You know, a regime could be preferable or superior, even if it's not a democracy, because it delivers economic growth, personal security, other things that people want. I think even on those grounds, if you look at the mass atrocities in China, if you look at the massive corruption in China, if you look at the unfolding real estate crisis in China, if you look at the massive indebtedness in China, if you look at the financial crisis that's looming in China, if you look at the demographic crisis in China, which is going to, over the next 30 years, lose 200 million working age individuals and gain 200 million senior citizens, that it's not making provisions for their social security. If you look at the resource crisis in China of increasingly scarce water, food, and energy, and I could just go down the list, it's hard to sustain the claim, and I think over time it will be increasingly hard to sustain the claim that the Chinese communist system is a superior system by its performance. As to the question of whether it's a democracy or not, I've made my point. And indeed, in a way, I think Beijing has made my point for me by clinging to, I think, in a kind of desperation, this fiction that China is really a democracy. It's just a different kind of democracy. They are revealing their own insecurity about the neo-totalitarian nature of their regime, and the fact that democracy is still the only broadly legitimate form of government in the world. So they feel that somehow globally they need to jump on the bandwagon. The second distinction that needs to be made is between what is believed inside China and what is recognized outside China. Outside China, the PRC may be scoring some propaganda campaign, incremental victories, and engaging in some successful disinformation. But its image around the world is actually in decline. And there is a very significant reaction at the popular level in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and elsewhere against the bullying and arrogance of the People's Republic of China. It is the case, I think it's difficult to dispute, that the regime, through its Orwellian control of information, propaganda, social media, and ideological indoctrination in the schools, universities, and so on, has had some success in socializing Chinese people, and particularly young people, into believing that the regime is legitimate and democratic. But I do not think it's at all clear that this is going to be sustainable, as the deep contradictions in the system become more and more apparent.
Given that, how do you see the trajectory of China's political development in both the short-term and the long-term future?
In the short term, I think the regime will become increasingly, as I said, neo-totalitarian. It will seek to more and more comprehensively control information, aggregate information to control human beings. But I think the regime is going to have a tough time sustaining this because of the performance contradictions in terms of the economy, in terms of resources, in terms of labor, and so on. And because the regime, in its paranoia and its hunger for absolute power and suspicion and intolerance of any form of civic pluralism or diversity in sources of power and influence, is cracking down on the goose that lays the golden eggs, which is its technology sector and its big corporations that are not, predatory real estate companies. And so I think, once you have intimidated the most dynamic sector of your economy, which is real private enterprise and technological private enterprise, you've really inflicted a pretty serious wound on your future economic prospects. And this is another one of the contradictions that I think the regime doesn't seem to have a theory of solving. As Xi Jinping becomes more and more paranoid about his grip on power, about the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of enemies he has made in the Chinese Communist Party by his arbitrary and personalistic crackdown on, quote, corruption, end quote, which is surely there and needed to be reined in, but has had a good deal of power consolidation for Xi as a central motive. I think the system is going to become more and more unstable and dangerous.
Do you think the case of China reveals the reality of global democracy retreat?
Well, I think the case of China is both reflection and cause of the global democracy retreat. So in that sense, it reflects a global trend of declining democracy and rising authoritarianism, but it is also a major contributor to the authoritarian trend through its projection of sharp power, its ideological warfare, its wolf warrior diplomacy, its military intimidation of its neighbors in East Asia, and so on.
So what should the U.S. do to reverse the course of a global democracy retreat we're facing right now?
Well, I think there are so many things. I think gathering the democracies together to renew their commitments to democracy and human rights within their own countries and globally is an important first step. In the geopolitical competition and tension between China and the United States, China and other democracies, and Russia and NATO and Russia and the United States, I think at once we have to show strength and also prudence and caution. If we don't show strength and resolve, including military strength and preparedness, it will invite aggression. And at some point, if it looks like, Taiwan won't defend itself, its friends won't come to its assistance, China will use military force to resolve the question. I have very little doubt about that, unless it is deterred. At the same time, I think we need to proceed with caution. We do not want to feed Cold War rhetoric or exaggerated fears on the part of the Russian and the Chinese leaders.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond, for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.